Welcome to this virtual trade mission. We're looking at the Australia-New Zealand marketplace today. We're looking to try and provide you with the information that you need from a very high level initially to look at the Australia-New Zealand marketplace, have some realistic expectations, and provide you some information that'll help you win in that marketplace. The WebEx today is in two parts. The first part is a high-level look at the big picture, comparing some of the basic information on New Zealand and Australia with similar categories in Canada and the US to give you some sense of size and nature of the market. And the second half of the webinar will be to understand what some of the routes to market are and give you some initial information as to how to select the best route and make the best choices as you look at the market. The format is a combination of presentation and Q&A. We should not be any longer than an hour. It'll be 45 minutes or less of presentation and then a Q&A period. After we're finished, within the next couple of days, we're going to send you some information on the marketplace. We're going to send a copy of the presentation and separately email a survey which we would ask you to fill in to help us hone these webinars and make them better. First of all, a very little bit about Preston Willis and how we fit into the marketplace. We work primarily with technology companies in the US and Canada, helping them grow their international sales activity. We help them grow their US domestic activity, and we also are involved in raising capital and exit strategies for technology companies. So we look at a company from the very startup right through to the late stage exit, and we offer services and products to help them at various stages of their growth. And today we're going to talk about international sales and how you could succeed in Australia and New Zealand. Speakers today are Brian O'Doherty, who's the Managing Director of NovaTech Ventures, and Jeff Skidmore, who's the New Zealand Country Manager. They're going to take over and talk to you about those particular markets, and at the end of their session we'll open it up to questions and answers. We'll unmute everybody. You can either use the voice to ask questions, or you can send a text in and get them answered separately. So with that, Brian, I'll turn it over to you, and Jeff, and we'll come back in when you're done.
Thanks very much, Glenn. Good afternoon, everybody. Brian O'Doherty is my name. I'm the CEO of NovaTech Ventures, as Glenn mentioned, and I'm based in Sydney, in Australia. My colleague Jeff is our New Zealand Country Manager, based in Auckland. What we'd like to do this morning is cover off two areas for you. One is some information about our markets in general. Wherever we can, we'll compare the data we have that we'll talk about it with Canada to give you a comparative view of our markets in comparison with Canada. And what we then like to do is give you some, I guess, tales from the coalface on what works down here for software companies coming from overseas, particularly coming from the Northern Hemisphere. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So what I'd like to do now is hand over to Jeff Skidmore to take you through some data about our markets down here. Over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Brian. Can you hear me okay, Brian?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, look, good afternoon, everyone. As Brian said, I'm the New Zealand Country Manager for NovaTech. And look, I've got about 8 slides here, which are fairly busy with figures and data, and I don't really intend to sort of go through all of them, but there's some sort of themes that I'd like to tease out. And I guess the overall theme is with many of the business measures that we've got here, if you put Australia and New Zealand together, it represents a similar sized market by a lot of these measures to Canada. And I guess the other thing is that there are substantial differences between Australia and New Zealand, and it's quite similar to the relationship in some ways between Canada and the US. There's this sort of smaller country that has this big brother, and we like to beat each other up on the sporting field, and we might make jokes about each other, but at the end of the day, if one or other is in need, the other country is probably going to be the first one to respond. So it's a very tight relationship in that respect. So just looking at this slide, so by business, like I say, if you put the Australia-New Zealand market together, it's a similar size. Same in terms of innovation. And in terms of branding, a little bit less, and it's probably you could probably put that down to what we call a sort of a she'll be right attitude, which I'm going to cover later in a slide on culture, which is sort of a near enough is good enough sort of type attitude. And in terms of transportation, well, substantially less sort of transportation infrastructure in Australia and New Zealand. Probably explained by the sort of the urbanisation of both Australia and New Zealand and the topography. So Australia's a large landmass, but where everyone chooses to live in the sunny sort of southeast corner of it, if you like. New Zealand's a long sort of skinny, well, not a long, long by our standards, skinny country with pretty substantial mountain range running right through the middle. So just by the topography, we're forced to live in sort of small areas, if you like, so highly urbanised. So just moving on to the next slide. Okay, so in terms of geography and people, similar sort of themes as the last slide. But as I said, population tends to be clustered into these large sort of urban areas, so Sydney, Melbourne, and Auckland. There's a point here that Australia is the most urbanised country in the world, and that's, like I say, really to do with the fact that if you look at the map, the middle of it's one big desert with the only people in it really are people pulling minerals out of the ground. So people tend to live in these large centres. English almost exclusively for business, but increasingly Australia and New Zealand becoming multicultural, so often speaking other languages in the home. Next slide. Thanks, Glenn. Okay, so in terms of infrastructure, more of the same really. Like I said before, transportation's quite different, but in most of the other measures the same. So I think we'll just skip over this slide to the economy slide. Where again, I don't really intend to go through each of these measures, but the theme is, like I say, similar sized markets, but really I guess the major difference is that Australia and New Zealand don't have this massive market right next door like you do in Canada. Okay, we're a long way from anybody. We're sitting in the middle of an ocean with not a lot of neighbours really, and the neighbours that we do have in some of those Asian markets, some of them are big, but a lot of them are small and very, very fragmented. So we'll talk a bit more in some of the future slides about what that means. But it does mean that we have some sort of special characteristics that make us quite different from the Canadian market. So the next slide, thanks. Okay, look, it's probably worth sort of dwelling on just quickly on each of these points. So in terms of the business culture, sort of modest and authentic. Kiwis and Australians have a nose for things that aren't authentic, and they sort of, we're confident people, but we're sort of more laid back, as we would call it here. We don't dwell on personal business achievements. There's a bit of a tall poppy syndrome here, as we call it, which is, if you stick your head over the parapet, you're likely to get shot down. It's not necessarily a good thing about our culture, but nonetheless, it's there, and you have to abide by it. We do take business seriously, even if, like I said, we seem to be laid back, as we call it, or relaxed. So in a way, we're sort of somewhere between sort of American and English culture. So not as direct as Americans, not the sort of rah-rah sort of kind of culture, but more direct than the English by and large. Competition can be fierce down here. Tends, just because of the nature of the small nature of the market. Segments of the market tend to be tend to be dominated by those that get there first and are well capitalised. So it tends to mean that there's 2 or 3 large companies that operate in the market. Duopolies exist, and they're often that's allowed to happen just because of the lack of options, if you like. So in terms of negotiation, yeah, we don't like to negotiate. So in that respect, we're probably more like the English than the Americans. And yeah, it's probably a facet of business that the seller and the buyer don't particularly enjoy. It's sort of a you go first kind of scenario. But yeah, you need to keep that in mind. And look, and local presence is critical, and that comes back to the tyranny of distance, if you like. So if you're trying to sell your product into this market, one of the first questions is going to be is, well, how are you going to support that? What someone doesn't really want in this market is to be the first customer of your product, and they will understand that you've got large customers in your own market that might take preference in terms of support. So they would want someone locally that they can talk to, that they can identify as being the local representative, and can help them out when things get into a situation. Okay, next slide, thanks. Okay, so in terms of population profile, look, largely European. In sort of pre-World War II, it was almost exclusively European. After World War II, Australia made a concerted effort to sort of populate the country, and more recently, New Zealand has done the same. So Auckland, where I live, is one of the most multicultural cities in the world, and I'm sure Sydney and Melbourne are not too far behind. Yeah, so that's really the strong sort of theme. There are indigenous local people, the Aboriginal folk of Australia and New Zealand Māori, and in New Zealand Māori are about 10% of the population, and Brian might be able to tell us what percentage the Aboriginal are in Australia. Is that something you got at the tip of your tongue, Brian?
It's probably 3%, Jeff. It's a small 3%. Number.
Right. Okay. So certainly in New Zealand, the Indigenous Maori are becoming a bit of an economic sort of powerhouse, and sort of heavily investing in infrastructure and things like that. Okay, next slide. Culture. So again, it's probably worth going through each of these points because it's important for business in Australia and New Zealand. The fair go. So we're sort of a egalitarian societies here, very much. The culture is that everyone deserves to be given a chance or a fair go. So and the flip side of that is the tall poppy syndrome, which is if you stand out, you're likely to get smacked down to everybody else's level. So that tends to mean that people, not that they keep quiet about their achievements, but fairly they don't sort of sing their own praises, I guess you would say. Conservative, certainly financially. Home ownership rates are very, very high here, and which is quite difficult in certain markets in Australia and New Zealand at the moment, where house prices are outstripping wage growth and all sensible measures. But that's just what you have to live with. And in terms of what sells, in Australia and New Zealand, we're much less likely to buy on sort of a market hype or sort of a momentum of a product. Again, it comes down to that tyranny of distance. People they want to understand that how it works, and it will work for them, and and that'll be supported, and probably more of a focus on justifying the cost of something before they buy. So quite conservative again in that respect. No tipping and low service, which sort of go together. So tipping is really frowned upon here, and I guess what it means is, from a business point of view, is that Kiwis and Australians will typically put up, with a lesser level of service. It's not to say that ultimately they'll keep putting up with that, but you can probably get away with a little bit more here than you might be able to in Canada or the US. I talked before about the she'll be right attitude, which is, and we've got another term in New Zealand which is called the number 8 wire sort of syndrome, which is sort of a DIY sort of culture where she'll be right, or I can fix that with a piece of number 8 wire or whatever, and like I say, near enough is good enough. Now my screen has just gone blank, which is not very helpful for me. Ah, it's back again. Right, we can probably go on to the next slide. Right, which is my last slide. Yeah, so the political legal, so you have very stable governments, easy to do business with. New Zealand, Australia, you can start a business, you can do everything online, you can literally do it within a day. You know, bureaucracy and red tape tends to be very low compared with other countries. And the last one's very important, low corruption. So there were some worldwide rankings published recently where I think New Zealand was number 3 in the world in terms of lack of corruption. Australia was right behind it. So, you know, from that point of view, very good place to do business. And yeah, in terms of government, you know, Australia has a federal system. New Zealand has a single sort of layer of government. So, yeah. So look, that's really it from the numbers point of view. I haven't sort of dwelled on the numbers themselves, but it's there for you to read. And yeah, happy to take some questions at the end on any of that. I'll pass it back to you, Brian.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you very much. By way of background, gentlemen, ladies, if we have any ladies today, just some background on NovaTech Ventures. We're a company based in Sydney head office, but with Jeff representing us in New Zealand. And we have a couple of areas of business that, by way of background to what I'm about to talk about here, is we help essentially technology companies generate demand in the local market. Our largest clients for many years have been SAP, Australia, New Zealand, the software group within IBM, a good Canadian company originally before they were acquired by IBM, Cognos, we did a lot of work for, and obviously local domestic Australian companies as well, software companies predominantly. And we have, over the last number of years, helped, because of my background, helped quite a number of Irish companies enter the Australian market, and interestingly, New Zealand companies enter the Australian market as well. So what I'm about to talk about here is, in effect, some of the lessons that we've learned in how to generate good demand for software companies domestically, and also software companies coming into the Australian New Zealand market for the first time. If you look at where most of the IT procurement market lies within Australia, it lies, and New Zealand, it lies within several cities. Sydney and Melbourne in Australia are the commercial hubs. Auckland is the commercial hub in New Zealand. And for government, selling to government, and government is a large market for software companies in both countries. It's Canberra, which is and Wellington, which are both very much focused on being government towns. So a little bit like Ottawa in Canada, I think, Glenn. So it's actually a very concentrated market. Sydney and Melbourne are typically about 5 million population each. Auckland, I think, is about 1.5 million. Canberra is about 500,000. Wellington, I think, is 200,000 or 300,000. Give it a rough size. But fundamentally, most software that's sold in Australia of an enterprise grade is sold into those particular cities. In terms of attitude, Australians and New Zealanders fundamentally understand that most enterprise grade software comes from the Northern Hemisphere. It doesn't emanate from Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Argentina, and you know, anything south of the equator. So what that does mean is Australian and New Zealanders are very, very open to new applications and new ideas coming from outside the countries. There isn't a notion that it has to be invented here simply because of our size. We're very quick to adopt new technologies once they're introduced, but we're usually lagging, in particular the US, by a couple of years in terms of adopting new technology simply because of our distance. What you find here within the local IT market is some very competent technical staff and also very competent sales staff. It's not unusual to find the Asia-Pac regional head office sitting in Singapore of multinational software companies, fundamentally staffed by Australian and New Zealanders who've moved up from Sydney or Auckland or Melbourne to run a regional operation across Asia sitting in Singapore. So there's a very competent technical demographic down here. As Jeff mentioned, one fundamental difference between Australia, New Zealand and Canada, notwithstanding the size comparisons we've just talked about, is fundamentally we're a long way away from anywhere else. And given my comments that most of our enterprise software tends to come from the Northern Hemisphere, it is an issue for enterprise buyers here to have some level of local support. So people are very understanding of new software companies coming into our market, very accepting of that. There's no reluctance to look at a software company coming from Ireland or the UK or Canada or the US. But what people absolutely do want to know is how is it going to be supported locally. And that's fundamentally a key issue on the delivery side. Thanks, Glenn. Okay, in terms of government, most major purchases of IT is fundamentally bought under some type of a panel contract at different levels of government. So the different levels of government we have here are in Australia, the Commonwealth government is based in Canberra. It is responsible for major areas like defence, social security and Medicare. And they are large, very large departments buying a lot of software. In New Zealand, the New Zealand government is based in Wellington, and then you then get into state governments in Sydney and in Melbourne. The New South Wales state government in Sydney is looking after a population of probably about 6 to 7 million, and the Victorian state government in Melbourne is looking after a somewhat slightly lesser number of people, probably about 6 million overall. And state governments in Australia are fundamentally responsible for police, hospitals, education, and local transport within that state. You then get into the smaller state governments in areas like West Australia, South Australia, Queensland, and Tasmania here, all a little smaller. And then there are a large number of local councils spread throughout Australia, 400, but in reality, there's 50 large councils, generally in the metropolitan areas of Sydney, Melbourne, and the other capital states. Most state governments have some type of a panel contract, and interestingly, over the last 12 months, the state governments have very deliberately made it easier for new software companies to be listed under a panel contract. And that's happened very recently here in Victoria and in New South Wales. So the governments are realizing that it's in government's interest to actually make it easier for new entrants to the market to actually sell into government, which I think is a good thing. Thanks, Matt. In terms of business and commercial accounts, as I mentioned, Australian and New Zealand companies are very open to overseas technologies. But what is important is how it actually works, and Jeff has alluded to that. So we buy off, how would I put it, a marketing pitch, much less than perhaps exists in the USA. What really is critical is down here, and I think it comes back to our geographic isolation, is how is this actually going to work for me in my business? How does the software work, and how is it actually going to be implemented, and how is it going to be supported? And North American and European companies are very well accepted here by all levels of enterprises, particularly software companies. We see a little less of a trend for overseas services companies to come into the Australian market, probably again because of our geographic isolation, and we're quite a small market. And I've got some numbers there to give you a rough idea of what I would call the enterprise software market, which is, we look at that as a market for that's constituted by companies with a turnover here of greater than 100 million Australian. There's about 5,000 to 6,000 companies of that size in Australia, and there's probably 500 companies of that size in New Zealand. So fundamentally, what we find with our clients is we're selling into that base of 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 companies very, very regularly in the enterprise software space. Thanks, man. In terms of competitors, Jeff alluded to this a little earlier around, we quite often see duopolies here in our market. Because of our geographic isolation, and fundamentally we're a $27 million, or 27 million people market, quite often we find there's significantly less competition in the software area than in the US. In many cases, we may find that 1 or 2 or 3 competitors actually end up dominating the market in a particular niche. So that has its positives, but it also has its negatives as well. From a local competitor's point of view, what a lot of local Australian companies, software companies, are unhappy with is they, in essence, don't get any real preference over overseas software companies. In particular, governments are quite often risk averse, and they're interested in buying up larger software companies rather than smaller, and that doesn't always help local Australian or Kiwi software companies compete in the government market. But what that does mean, I think, is if you're coming in from overseas, there is no real preference from an enterprise level here to have people buy Australian or New Zealand software. People are just as happy to buy software from the Northern Hemisphere, in essence, provided it's well supported locally. One thing to be careful of, and we see this with a number of our clients, is if you're selling in Europe or you're selling in certainly the USA, you can quite often focus on 1 or 2 verticals only and be very, very successful. It's hard to do that here, and it's hard to do that here because quite often those same verticals are actually quite shallow. So you do need to be a little bit careful around market sizing. We're working with an Irish software company at the moment who sells to universities exclusively in Europe and North America, Canada and the US. And our advice to them here is you simply can't build a business here around universities only. Too shallow. We only have 55 universities in Australia and New Zealand. So you need to go into other verticals like state government and local councils where they do actually have a presence, but it's not their main focus. So a corollary of that as well also is we think it's wise for our clients to, as much as possible, look at putting recurrent revenue commercial arrangements in place. So in other words, selling term licenses or SaaS solutions or cloud solutions, perhaps, rather than on-premise solutions with a one-off fee and a maintenance fee. And what that does is allow you to fundamentally grow a business consistently, knowing that it's going to stick around. And that's again a determinant that flows out from the fact that our market's actually quite small. Thanks, Glenn. Just by way as to why you might consider coming to the Australian-New Zealand region from a software point of view, one of our clients, John O'Connor from a small Irish company, Deep Insight, he had a nice comment which I've included here, which is it's nice actually to come down to an economy that's working. John made this. John basically sells in Ireland, the UK, and the US, and obviously with the GFC that's hit over the last few years, Australia and New Zealand basically avoided the global financial crisis. We never actually went into recession at all during that last 5 years. So we've been actually a very good place to sell software into. Our growth over the next few years, I've put some numbers there. We're growing quite a nice steady clip. As Jeff mentioned, English is the business language here, notwithstanding that we have secondary languages spoken in many homes. But fundamentally, if you're coming from an English-speaking country, in effect, your software is highly unlikely to need any localization down here, unless there's some specific business reason why you need to change your software to address Australian, New Zealand requirements. But usually, we find our clients coming in from overseas don't have an issue with any localization issues. And Australia is a good stepping off point, and New Zealand, but Australia in particular, a good stepping off point into Southeast Asia, we believe, particularly the English-speaking countries of where English is essentially the business language of Southeast Asia, so Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia. As I mentioned earlier, there's a good base of Australian and New Zealand, both sales and technical staff resident typically in Singapore or Hong Kong. And Australian and New Zealand staff are well regarded across all of Southeast Asia. So Australia can often be, and New Zealand, a good jumping off point into Asia once our clients are established in our region here. Thanks, Glenn. Just a quick overview of what buyers expect here in our experience. As I've mentioned a couple of times, there really is no need to look like an Australian or a New Zealand software company here, unlike the US, where the US buyer typically wants to have a feeling they're dealing with a US company. US, Canadian, European software companies are all very well accepted here. However, what people do want to see with overseas software companies coming into our market is some local presence, obviously. And that can be either a reseller, it could be an agent, or it could be somebody being sent out from head office to kickstart the business here in Australia and New Zealand. In terms of implementation, a lot of our overseas clients we've worked with over the years typically will send out staff from head office to do an initial installation and also training of their partner, their delivery organization here, and that's always viewed very positively by a first client. And at some point in time, then we tend to see that the third, fourth, fifth client then starts to want to see these implementations being done by local ANZ staff. In terms of support, what is absolutely critical is that essentially there's people ring an Australian or a New Zealand support number, and in our business hours get some level of local support, even if it's quite cursory. It can simply be what I've called here a call logging service, rather than providing in-depth level 1, and certainly level 2 and level 3 support is quite usually provided out of head office somewhere in the Northern Hemisphere. Thanks, Glenn. So just summing up all of that, we're a long way away from anywhere else, and that actually seeps through the psychology of the buyers you're selling to. Even though these days it's getting easier and easier and quicker to get from Sydney, Melbourne, Auckland to the Northern Hemisphere, the major areas in the Northern Hemisphere, there still is a mindset here that we're a long way away from anywhere. So what we are looking for is somebody who has some presence in our region. Cost of living here is quite high. In particular, we find with Irish and UK software companies, when they come here, they're quite surprised by the cost of real estate. Sydney's an expensive town. Melbourne's getting that way. Auckland a little less so. But essentially, the cost of living is quite high. Standards of living are good. But the corollary of all of this is there's usually less competition than in the Northern Hemisphere. So very regularly, we recommend to our clients they increase substantially the cost of their software that they're selling in the UK or in North America as a way of grabbing revenue that's there, but also covering off the fact that our cost of living is quite high. And as I've mentioned a couple of times, local support is pretty critical. Very definitely, given the shallowness of our market, if you're going into one niche only, or two verticals or three verticals, you're selling into quite a narrow set of verticals, we'd seriously recommend to our clients that they look at some type of recurring or term license pricing rather than perpetual. Thanks, Glenn. Okay, in terms of going to market, given our distance from other markets, this is something that becomes a critical issue for overseas software companies looking to address our particular market. Hiring locally is one option. Recruiting a reseller, sending somebody from head office is quite often a good way of building up a base here. Or in our case, part of our business is effectively helping our clients put together what we call an entry team. And it's worth having a look at all these different options before you obviously start to come down here. Thanks, Glenn. In terms of hiring locally, typically, if people are going to do this, they would locate a single salesperson, typically in Sydney or Melbourne, flying to the other capital cities as and when required. Because Sydney and Melbourne are probably the two largest commercial markets, they're an hour apart on a flight. The flights between Sydney and Melbourne are very, very regular. So it is entirely possible to have a salesperson based in Sydney or Melbourne and flying to the other major city in Australia, or flying to Auckland, or flying to Adelaide, Brisbane, or Perth. I've put some rough ideas of compensation down there to give you an idea of what senior sales executives or sales managers are typically earning down here. These are Australian dollars. Airfares are reasonably expensive here in comparison, say, with the US or even Europe, simply because we have really a duopoly within Australia. You have Air New Zealand flying in and out of Air New Zealand, but we actually have quite a small population, and there isn't a lot of competition in the airline industry. So airfares are perhaps a little bit more expensive than in Europe or North America. And one key issue we find is something that our clients need to be, our companies who are entering the market here and looking to hire a full-time person initially to represent them, is what I call the hire, fire, and rehire risk. It's fundamentally because we're a long way away from anywhere else. It's sometimes difficult to manage from London or New York a single salesperson sitting in Sydney or Melbourne or Auckland. And quite often what we find is, even with good salespeople here, they essentially get worn down by the time distance, phone calls late at night, phone calls very early in the morning, and quite often even good salespeople, when they're doing a good job, will wander off and get employed by a local company after a number of years with an overseas company, effectively kickstarting their business. So you need somebody who's very, very self-sufficient, and that is a risk. We're talking to a UK software company at the moment who has had 3 salespeople leave over about 3 or 4 years. Each time they hire somebody new, tool them up, the last 12 months, and then they move on. So that is a risk in hiring an individual, but it certainly can work. Thanks, Dan. In terms of recruiting resellers, good resellers are much sought after here. Most of the major software vendors, and we do a considerable amount of work with the IBM software group and SAP, for example, and we do a lot of work with their resellers in Australia. Most of those resellers, if they're good, they generally have the ability to look at numerous software applications that they might represent. So it's attracting good resellers can be an issue here, mainly because the larger software vendors actually have very well set up channel arrangements in place today. And what that means is a good reseller probably has more options in terms of software they can resell than they can poke a stick at. And I don't know whether this is the case in Canada, but certainly what we find here is the resellers down here are generally more interested in selling known brand solutions rather than interesting software products, but from smaller companies. Many of the resellers down here will, again, because companies like IBM and SAP have very well funded co-marketing programs, they will typically expect a software IP owner, the principal, to kickstart some marketing and co-fund some marketing in the early days. Typically, resellers here are generating those type of margins in terms of reselling a product. And hence the questions I've noted down here is, we have quite a small reseller base. They're usually busy. Getting their time and attention is quite often an issue. And we have done quite a bit of work with overseas software companies setting up their reseller networks here. It just takes a bit of time. Thanks, Glenn. Another very well-worn path to success here is actually sending out a competent person who knows your business very well to kickstart it here. Having somebody who knows how the mothership works back at head office in the Northern Hemisphere is a huge advantage in this case. So what that means is you can ramp up quickly. clients and prospects here like that a lot because they see that as a commitment to the local market. And then over time, you might then start to hire new local Australian staff and train them up. So that's a very well trusted path, and it absolutely does work. We currently are doing a small bit of work with an Irish company where they've sent down a guy who's based in Toronto, who set up their Canadian operation over 2 or 3 years, and now he's been shifted down here to Sydney to do likewise over the next year to 18 months. So it definitely works if you can afford to have that person away from HQ for a number of years. Thanks, Dan. And finally, the last option that maybe you may not be familiar with, but it's a part of our business that's been growing in the last couple of years, is where in effect you hire a team of local people, but effectively on a part-time basis. So we're calling this option that we're been providing for a number of years now, sales as a service. It effectively allows you to get a range of skills from country management, sales people, and lead generation people on a part-time basis. With the key issue is de-risking market entry by trying to minimize expenditure until it's proven that you actually have a market down here. We think that has some significant benefits if that's relevant, and over a period of time we would see some of our clients transitioning to maybe having their own full-time staff here. Increasingly, we find that there is some level of export facilitation funding from a government export agency to help with this type of an approach. The key issues that we look to address in this particular this model is getting some good pre-sale support and some good proposal development support from our clients in the Northern Hemisphere. But if that's solvable, then this potentially is quite a good option. It always then still does require some assistance from HQ staff, particularly for bigger opportunities or more complex deals, as I've mentioned. Thanks, Glenn. So just by way of background, sales as a service is an option in addition to those other 3 options I mentioned. It's something that we've been working on here for a couple of years. The aim very much with it is actually to reduce risk in time to revenue by avoiding full-time headcount or needing to send somebody out from the head office for a number of years. Thanks, Glenn. And really what it's designed to do, as we've outlined in this graph here, is fundamentally reduce the risk and the investment needed to actually get you to a point where you're at break even with revenues coming in the door, as against the expenditure you need to put in to grow your business here. Thanks, Glenn. In terms of marketing down here, very few software companies other than the larger companies, so the SAPs, the Oracles, the IBMs of the world, actually advertise conventionally. What we are seeing is marketing managers down here, or in fact marketing managers in our clients overseas head office, are actually using digital marketing to address the Australian and New Zealand marketplaces. And that's a model that works quite well. We're seeing this being taken up significantly by our domestic clients and our clients from the Northern Hemisphere. What is critical is then being able to follow up inquiries that come in through your digital marketing channels locally. So it is very feasible to start to run a significant marketing program here based out of the Northern Hemisphere if you're doing it digitally. Thanks, Dan. And finally, just to summarize our recommendations to our clients, is it usually takes a bit longer to get going here than you might expect, anywhere from 6 to 12 months if you're selling enterprise solutions. You can get lucky and start to generate revenues in a couple of quarters, but because you're quite often addressing a relatively small number of prospective accounts, if that slips, you quite often will find it can be 12 months before you generate some substantial revenue. So just factor that into your planning if you're considering coming down here. In terms of getting a local reference, it's absolutely critical. The faster you can get a local reference down here, that takes away all the concern around local support local implementation and local presence, the better. People will buy off having good overseas references here. So if I'm an insurance company and you've done a lot of good work with insurance companies that are well known in US, Canada, UK, Europe, that helps initially. But within a period, people want to see you having an insurance company reference down here. And the sooner you can get that reference, the better, given our geographic isolations. It's you'll get a lot of kudos down here from simply turning up. The fact that you've taken the time to come down from the Northern Hemisphere, and you may do that a couple of times a year, or you actually go interstate from Sydney or Melbourne to our smaller states like Perth in WA, Adelaide, Brisbane, Christchurch in New Zealand, in the South Island. All of that gains you a lot of brownie points and a lot of kudos, and people will very definitely give you a lot of consideration as a software company if you fundamentally take the time and effort to visit them, given our distance away. Start small, start smart, low risk. Pick your verticals to go after. When I was kickstarting Sterling Commerce's business down here in the 90s, the advice that the CEO gave me, who was based in Columbus, Ohio, was just pick one industry, Brian. Pick one industry, pick our strongest industry, and go after that industry and get some references in that industry. And that's what we did in retail for Sterling, who had very good credentials with people like Walmart in the US. So pick a vertical that is your strongest vertical and go hell for leather for it, get some references here, and then expand into secondary industries. And absolutely, given we have as you might have really picked up by now, first-class support is a key here. If you give first-class support here, that'll count for a lot with winning new clients in your vertical, in that first vertical. Thanks, Glenn. And look, I think we've probably covered all of this previously. Low risk, local presence is key. Keep in the back of your mind that people have in the back of their minds, people you're selling to, you're a long way away. How can that risk be mitigated? Try and get some local salespeople on the ground as fast as you can, however you do it, and then start to put some local support in, even if it's basic call logging initially. As I mentioned a couple of times, recurrent revenues are best here, we think, for software companies, given our market's relatively shallow. Thanks, Glenn.
Great, thanks, Brian. Thanks, Jeff. We're going to open it up to any questions at this point. You can either unmute and call them in, or use the chat feature. I think everybody's unmuted now. So, any questions from anyone? Oh, okay. Well, we're going to be sending a couple of handouts. Here's a question from Brian to Brian about what a local panel is, Brian. That was in reference to the government purchasing.
Indeed. Yeah, Brian. What a panel contract, which is typically a government contract, is where the government selects a number of vendors, pre-approved vendors, through a central contracting agency. So, and each government, both Commonwealth in Canberra and the larger state governments, will have a central contracting agency who will fundamentally let a contract, usually under a standardized contract, let an arrangement under a standardized contract called the Government Information Technology Contract here, or GITC. So, so the pre-approved vendors, the term that's used here is go on the panel. So if I'm a provider of financial applications, you might have 3 or 4 financial applications on the panel, and what it allows a government department or a local government entity, anybody fundamentally that's funded by that government, to buy off that centralized contract that's been pre-approved. So the term that's used is that's a panel contract, because usually there's a number of vendors on that contract. And And as I mentioned, increasingly the governments are actually making it easier for software companies to get on, and IT services companies to get on those panels. Previously it was quite restricted. So it's a very important mechanism to sell your software into a government.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Any other questions? Okay, well, as you can see from this slide, we're going to be sending some material out along with a video replay of the presentation in the next day or so. In addition, we'll be sending out a survey which we'd ask you to complete and return to us. And Brian has an offer here. If you'd like to talk to him about your business and your abilities to market into Australia, he'd be happy to do a complimentary consultation and talk to you about what a target list of accounts might look like for your business for Australia and New Zealand. And if you'd like that, please just contact Brian directly. His email will be on the email we're sending out with the materials. I'd like to thank you for listening to us today, and if you have any other questions, please ask them, or if you'd like to email us later, we're happy to answer these questions when you send them in. Thanks very much. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Jeff, and thank you guys for attending.
Thank you.